Hey folks, this is Riker, and if you're looking for the best leveling builds for Last Epoch, Maxroll has you covered. In this video, we'll talk about the best leveling setup for each of the 15 masteries in the game, and how they compare to each other at getting you from 1 to 70. The game doesn't stop at 70 though, you got another 30 levels to go. Check out our top 10 best builds video to know where you want to go in the end game. That said though, I encourage everyone to enjoy the game at your own pace. Don't follow guides if you don't want to, but for those who do want to know what the best builds are, who want to follow guides, or at least get an understanding of how good each class and mastery in Last Epoch is at leveling, then the Maxroll Last Epoch team consists of experts who know this game inside and out, who theory crafted and tested every setup. And today we'll be talking to Tarek, who is Maxroll's Last Epoch leveling expert. He crafted every leveling guide, finding the best setup for each of the 15 masteries. As a reminder, Last Epoch has 5 base classes, and each class has 3 masteries. Now, just a disclaimer, the gameplay footage you'll be seeing in the background is taken from a pre-release version of the game, 0.9.2. Unfortunately, we couldn't get recent footage of every build here, so we're just showing generic footage from the class, and we'll be displaying pop-ups for the skills that Tarek will be telling you folks about. Now, as we start talking about leveling builds, leveling guys, we've got this tier list here with a few different tiers of power. Some of these builds are going to be better at leveling than others. What does S tier, A tier, B tier mean? How do you compare an S tier build to a B tier build?
I think it's the overall power of the build, how fun it is, and how smooth the progression of the build is. So it has to have everything for S tier, and B tier has either like one part that is very bad or multiple parts that are like a bit behind. Like it's trying to take into account all those values.
All right, so your S tier builds, they're hitting that trinity of very powerful, very smooth progression throughout the campaign of going through different stages of the build where you don't have to like change skills very often and drastically change the build. That's what you mean, right?
Yeah, so those builds have mostly like 2 setups. One where it's like very early on, like the early levels, until you unlock like maybe your mastery or your third skill, your third spec slot in your skill UI. And then it's like the same build for the rest of the campaign and the early end game. And you have like some other builds that have like way more setups than this. Like I'm saying way more. It's like basically 3 setups. Others where you have like transitional setup where you want to switch from the early game setup to like another one, but you cannot do it like instantly. So you kind of have to have like an in between those 2 setups. And you have also like builds that have like you could do the full build setup, like the final setup as early as possible as you start the game. But at early level, it's like not powerful. So you do something else and then you switch to that other one.
But nonetheless, all the builds here, they're all viable. They can all easily defeat all the content in the game and get you to 70. It's just that some you'll have an easier time with than others.
Exactly, like all of those builds can do the full game, full campaign, I mean, and early end game. There's not going to be any problem. The damage, the survivability, and the defense are all covered in all of those builds. It's mainly like comparing builds between each other. Alright,
so let's start by diving into the classes and their masteries. Let's talk about the Sentinel. What are its strengths, its weaknesses compared to the other classes in the game? And then let's do the same for its masteries.
Yeah, so Sentinel is overall like a well-rounded class during leveling. It's very strong early thanks to Rive, where it's going to summon forged weapons, and later on with Healing Hands, which is going to give you massive recovery every time you use a melee attack or smite.
Alright, let's dive into the Sentinel's mastery, starting with the Paladin.
So Paladin is a leveling build that revolves around Holy Trail. So it is a sub-skill procced by Javelin, and it's going to basically draw a line on the ground where it's going to have like dots, and you're going to be like very fast because you're going to use also Shield Rush, and you're going to throw your Javelin, use Shield Rush, and all the monsters are going to get behind you and die on the Holy Trail. It's also very powerful because you're going to get a lot of regen, like the Holy Trail itself is going to heal you. So this build is definitely an S tier. The progression also is very smooth. As soon as you unlock Holy Trail, you're never gonna die. You're also gonna deal a lot of damage. The only downside is that you're kind of locked into a certain playstyle where you're gonna want to use your Javelin and then Shield Rush, because the Javelin itself has a cooldown. So that's mainly the only downside of the build.
Next up, let's talk about the Forge Guard.
Forge Guard is a build that revolves around summoning forged weapons. It is very powerful and very fun if you like minion playstyle. The minions that you're going to summon are called forged weapons, and it is a minion that scale based on the stat of your weapon. So getting a good weapon on that build is going to be very important, but also I find it like very fun. It has basically way more importance than other builds. And so in terms of power, it's going to be like a blast. You're never going to struggle dealing damage to bosses, clearing enemies, and you basically have kind of the same playstyle, just using different skill as you level. You're always going to summon forged weapons, and the further you go, you're also going to have like more tools in order to buff your weapons. So overall, a solid A tier. I highly recommend that build, even though Forge Guard is not that popular, I think.
All right, now let's talk about the Void Knight.
Void Knight, this is going to be a build that uses a spell themed around Void. There is also the possibility to use melee attack, but I found that using spells is more powerful during leveling. So this version is going to use spell, but there's going to be another guide that is going to use Warpath. So for all of the minion enjoyers, don't worry, there's going to be a guide for it later on Maxroll. And this guide is revolving around an ability called Abyssal Echo. And every time you use it, it's going to put like a dot on the monster. And if you use a melee attack, and not necessarily a melee attack, but if you hit the monster, it's going to deal the full damage of the dot. And so the concept of the build is basically applying Abyssal Echo and hitting the monster to proc the full damage of the Abyssal Echo. And so that build, unfortunately, is kind of unfun to play on bosses, because you have to press all the time at least 3 abilities, and even 4 if you want to min-max. So that's why I put it in B tier. Also, the scaling is a bit weird on this build, but it's still going to be strong. I made sure that that was the best possible build you could do for leveling on Void Knight. But yeah, at the moment Void Knight is not that strong if you want to stay in the fantasy of the mastery, at least for leveling.
Alright, next let's talk about the Mage class.
Alright, so the Mage is very strong throughout the whole campaign and early game. It has solid damage, and with the recent addition of the Runemaster, Mage basically became like the most tanky class. If you compare it to other classes during leveling, it's crazy the amount of ward that you can generate on this class. So yeah, very strong class overall.
And ward is a defensive system that works how?
So ward is basically on top of your health, and it's a stat. It's basically a shield that decays over time.
Sort of like an energy shield?
Yeah, kind of like an energy shield.
All right, let's talk about his first mastery, the Sorcerer.
The Sorcerer leveling build revolves around lightning, and we're going to use 2 abilities in that build for dealing damage. One called Lightning Blast for a single target, and the other called Static Orb for clearing. The power of the build went up after the Runemaster got released, but I haven't had time to recraft it again, so I suspect it's going to go in A tier once I do some further optimization on the build. But at the moment, I consider it a B tier. Progression is kind of smooth. I would say the only problem at the moment is going to be the power of the build, and I think it's pretty fun to play. Kind of in between A and B tier, I would say.
Alrighty, but potentially going to rise to A once you get a chance to work out more optimizations on it.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to talk about the Spellblade next?
The Spellblade is going to revolve around Shadow Strike, a cold ability that is very powerful during leveling. It is actually one of the highest damage ability in the game during leveling. But in order to get that power, to reach that level, you kind of have to earn that power with levels. You have to unlock first Ancient Weapon, and then you're going to unlock Firebrand. So the gameplay might not be for everyone, but I think it's still going to be fun overall, because it's basically a builder-spender type of build, where you have to build with Firebrand stacks that is going to buff your Shadow Strike. Overall, I think it's an A tier. Very strong, smooth, and it's very satisfying to unlock the upgrades for the build.
Alright, last let's talk about the Runemaster.
So the Runemaster is gonna revolve around Frostclaw. So Frostclaw is not an ability that is exclusive to Runemaster, but we want to use it in combination with all the buffs and the tree of the Runemaster to take full advantage of it. So early on, you're gonna play with Frostclaw and converting it to a fire ability, and that means that you can convert the chill on your weapon and on your tree to ignite chance, and that way you have a lot of dots that is applied. And later on, you're gonna transfer that skill to Cold instead. So basically you have a node in the passive tree of Runemaster that convert the shred, the armor shred chance, into frostbite chance. This build is a bit unconventional in its weapon choice because you're gonna use not a staff, but actually any type of like two-handed melee weapons, because you want to actually get shred on your weapon, and staves don't have shred as a suffix. And so this is basically a mage wearing a big axe, dealing tons of damage, and also being extra tanky because he has, like I said before, for the mage class, Runemaster introduced a lot of ways to generate ward. So overall, like very smooth progression. The build is very strong. It is very fun to play.
All right, let's talk about the rogue class next.
So the rogue has the most consistent damage and is easily the fastest class on the list. But this is at the expense of lower defenses options, and you're gonna rely a lot on using your dummy strategically. Overall, very strong class.
So the dummy is a skill that will taunt monsters to it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start by talking about the Bladedancer mastery of the rogue.
So the Bladedancer is a build that is going to revolve around using Umbral Blades. Now, basically blade that you would spec so that they spin on the ground, and they're going to apply an element called Shadow Daggers. And Shadow Dagger has the advantage of dealing insane amount of damage as soon as you can do it early in the campaign. And so this build has an insane like damage curve, as well as being insanely fast thanks to Shift, because Shift also, which is your movement ability, also gives you a movement speed boost, a very big one at that. And so not only the build is strong, I think it's very fun to play, and also the progression is insanely smooth once you unlock your Umbral Blades.
All right, let's talk about the Marksman mastery next.
So the Marksman leveling build is going to use Explosive Trap, an ability introduced with the Falconer mastery at 1.0. And it is also going to use the mastery skill from Marksman called Detonating Arrow. And it's a bit of a weird leveling build where you're going to start with Bleed, where you want to apply a lot of bleed thanks to Puncture. And then you want to transition over time to a hit-based build. So that's the reason why it's in A tier, is because you cannot change how you deal damage while still using kind of the same attacks. But the damage is really good, especially early on and later during the early endgame. And overall, I think it's very, very fun using Explosive Trap as a bow attack. So I would say it's a solid A tier.
And last, let's talk about the new kid on the block, the Falconer.
Alright, so Falconer, the big boy of the three. This one seems to be really, really strong and also really fun to play. So it's an hybrid class where you have to use your attack, which is going to buff your Falcon, and the Falcon is going to do also most of the damage. But you can still kill with your own attacks. And so this build is very fun to play. The only, I would say, downside to it is the mana management, where you might want to build a lot into mana recovery options, like increase mana regen on gear and the passive tree, as well as on Shift. You have like some points where you can get mana back when you use it. But yeah, very strong class. I love it. You should definitely play it S tier.
Next, let's talk about the Acolyte.
So the Acolyte is also a well-rounded class with insane clearing potential. I think that's what differentiates it from the other one, at least for leveling. It has good defenses for every playstyle. So no matter if you play minion, spell, and it can be really, really fast if you play a Lich, because you're able to use two movement skill, which is, I think, exclusive to that mastery.
All right, let's dive into the first of the masteries of the Acolyte, the Necromancer.
Okay, so the Necromancer, For all the minion enjoyers, be happy. This is very strong. I would say you can definitely play with that class only with minions, only using minions all the time. It's basically like a minion army build where you're gonna change the minion that you use over time, but the core concept is the same. You basically have an army of minions that follow you around and destroy everything around you. You can summon a volatile zombie, which is a temporary minion that is gonna explode on monsters. So you kind of have like a way to also actively influence your gameplay. And you also want to refresh a buff called Dreadshade. And that buff is lasting like a few seconds. You just have to target one minion and then it buff all the minions around. So it's very easy to play, kind of like a passive-active playstyle depending on the situation. And it scales really well during the leveling. The only downside I would say is that on that build you're not going to use any movement ability. And the reason being is because you want more minion. So solid A tier.
Alright, next let's talk about the Lich mastery.
So Lich is going to be your necrotic mage of some sort. But for this leveling guide we're going to play with poison. So they introduce the Warlock with 1.0 and we got something called Poison Overload, which is going to be a huge help for our build, which will increase our damage massively, which is the reason why we are going poison. And this build also deals a lot of damage, is very smooth progression. The only downside would be maybe the playstyle can be a bit tricky sometimes. You're going to have like an ability that is going to reserve a portion of your life, and another ability that also transforms you and gives you another health bar. So you kind of have to watch out for your health bar basically on this build. But it's very smooth, which is why I put it in A tier.
Alright, and lastly let's talk about the newest Acolyte mastery, the Warlock.
The Warlock, a mastery that revolves around curses. So there's going to be a lot of interaction with curses on that build, but we want to deal our damage mainly through bleeds. And so the main ability of that class is going to be a Chthonic Fissure, and from that fissure you're going to proc another ability called Chaos Bolt, which in turn is going to proc two other abilities. So you can already see where it's going. It's like an infinite sort of proccing build where you proc bleeds from multiple abilities at the same time while just casting one ability. You don't have to cast everything. And so this build, I put it in A tier because it's very strong. Offensively, defensively, you have good mobility. The progression is very smooth. I would just say that you have to watch out for the mana consumption of the build. Kind of play with the skill point if you struggle with mana, and get some gear with mana regen if possible.
Alright, and lastly let's talk about the Primalist class.
Primalist. So this one unfortunately has a weaker early game compared to the other classes at the moment. But it's strong after the early game, like late campaign, early end game, it's very strong. Plus, it can be like very, very tanky during leveling if you use totems or Warcry in your build.
Alright, let's talk about his first mastery, the Shaman.
So the Shaman is going to use totems, and this is one of the smoothest playstyle and build you could play during leveling. So you're gonna summon Thorn Totem, and those totems are gonna heal you and at the same time deal a lot of damage to the monsters. And the progression on that build is very, very smooth. You're gonna see your damage ramping throughout the whole leveling. And also you're never gonna die because you're gonna get so much heal from the totems themselves. So overall, very, very strong build. It's in S tier. I think it's still a bit lower than some of the other ones, but the fact that the progression is so smooth and that you cannot die on that build makes it a top contender.
Alright, let's talk about the Druid mastery next.
So the Druid leveling is going to use Swarmblade form in order to generate a massive AoE around you, basically killing everything in its path. This is kind of the goal of the build. But in order to get there, you kind of have to go through a few levels. And in order to get through those levels, we're kind of getting inspiration from the Shaman leveling, where we're going to play with totems. And once we unlock the skills that we need, that's where we're going to switch to Swarmblade form. And it's basically the gameplay is going to revolve around applying bleeds and generating locust and then you're going to consume the Locust, and depending on the number of bleed on the monster, you're going to generate a big area around you that is going to deal more damage. So this area also lasts a certain amount of time, so you have to refresh it over time, but it's dealing so much damage to give you an idea that in the campaign you're literally going to one-shot any monster. Even bosses are going to last 4 seconds, 5 seconds at most, so very, very strong build. The only downside is obviously the very active playstyle, and also you kind of have to wait until you unlock that skill that is key to the build. Strong A tier build for me.
And then lastly, we have the Beastmaster Mastery.
The Beastmaster build is going to use wolves, and you're basically going to use an ability called Swipe, and from each of your wolf, it's going to proc spirit wolves that is going to attack the enemies from the position of your wolves. And so that build is kind of like playing in melee range with your minions. The only downside is that you cannot really have that playstyle until you have a few points and a few levels on your character. So early on, you will play with Swipe, with Totem, and then once you have enough point into Wolf, that's where you're going to transition. You're going to unlock new skills that is going to buff also your minions. And overall, this build is going to be extremely strong. Once you get the levels and the gear, it's actually one of the strongest. Progression is where I would say it's a bit of a downside, where early on it's like not ramping that hard in terms of damage. You're gonna struggle maybe a bit. That's why I put it in A tier instead of S tier. Otherwise, if the early campaign part was like very easy, I would say I would put it in S tier, like no problem. But yeah, very fun to play and very strong also.
Now, for each of these masteries, you guys on Maxroll, or you specifically, Tarek, have made a guide, but there are other ways that you can play these masteries, these classes. You've just found in your own theory crafting and experimentation that these are optimized setups, but you're also looking to expand and offer multiple potential playstyles for leveling per mastery as a long-term kind of plan. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Basically, we want to have like every playstyle covered for each mastery, so that you don't feel locked into one specific playstyle, because that's the only guide that we have currently on Maxroll. I know we had like a lot of requests, for example, on Void Knight, having like a melee leveling. So yeah, that kind of stuff, just so that people have more choices.
So there you have it, folks. An introduction to the best setups to level you from 1 to 70 on each mastery. And you can check out the full build guides on Maxroll, link in the description below. And go give Tarek a follow. Go check him out on Twitch. Ask him questions live about any of these builds or guides or about Last Epoch in general. Thanks for watching. Be sure to have checked out our video on the top 10 best builds going into Last Epoch patch 1.0. Special thanks to my Twitch, YouTube, and Patreon supporters for making these videos possible, and subscribe to join Rikers Raiders for more ARPG content.